At least I thought so. Yeah. Fighting.
This guy, he's a sociologist, and so he knows demography, and these are his speculations. He said that by the year 40, 10 years after Jesus is gone, he believes there might be 1,000 Christians. And then going on the algorithm or whatever, that there's a 40% increase in the number of Christians per decade. It rises to 1,400 in the year 50 and 7,530 by the year 100. But then by the year 200, it's 218,000. So the second century saw a huge growth. And then by the year 300, it's 6.3 million, or 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. So you can see that Christianity kind of caught on. And then by the year 350, 56.5% of the Roman Empire is Christian. Okay? So there you go. A little bit speculative, but based on good methodology. One of the books that I'm using and that I find to be very readable is called The Last Week. This book is about Holy Week and what seems to, or what they believe actually happened, at least what these two authors believe actually happened. Okay? John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg.
Oh.
Okay? So,
Good people.
Recommend that. And now, the Passion story in the Gospel of Mark. By way of prelude, and I just read this over the weekend, one of the things that we have to be aware of as we're looking at the Gospels is to overcome the temptation to conflate the Gospel stories. In other words, to believe you can just take Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, kind of paste them together, and you have a fairly complete picture of the life of Jesus. That's not the case. You can't take details from Luke and plug them into Mark, or details from Matthew and plug it into John. That just doesn't work. Each one of the four Gospels pretty much has to stand on its own. Now, the classic time when we do that is Christmas. We conflate the Matthew and Lucan stories all the time. So here are the choirs singing to the shepherds, and then here come the Magi. Okay? That's fine for liturgy. It's not very good for understanding the theology behind the infancy narratives. Okay? As I've said numerous times, and often get the what response, which I understand, these stories are far more theological than they are historical. Okay? And that's not to say that they're just making it up. What they're doing is they're articulating, using the literary styles and techniques of their own day and age. They're articulating their faith in Jesus, who they believe he was, what his mission was, and what his message is for his followers. Does that make sense? Okay? So to try to read the Gospels as biographies in the way we understand biography today doesn't work. That's not what the Gospels are. Alright? And so each one of them really should stand on its own. And we should try to understand the theology and the message of Luke for who Luke is, and Mark for who Mark is, etc. Okay. So, the Passion story in the Gospel of Mark. And I chose Mark because Mark is probably the earliest of the four written Gospels, the 4 written canonical Gospels. Okay? And so what we get in the Gospel of Mark is kind of the closest window to Jesus' own life. I'm not saying it's more biographical, but the depiction of Jesus and the depiction of his apostles and etc. Let's just say Jesus is far less divinized and far less, majestic. He's more a human being. So you hear statements about his emotions. He gets angry with people, and he's upset with people, and he's actually a little bit sharp with people sometimes. Okay, which may be more a reflection of the real Jesus than the Jesus of John, who is almost like this superhuman being walking around the earth. Almost. He's not, but almost. Okay. So, kind of the lead up to the Passion, the events of Holy Week in the Gospel of Mark. And by the way, we're going to go till 11 today, if that's okay. All right. If you have to go ahead. We'll make fun of you after you leave. But whatever. Okay. So Palm Sunday. So what we have on Palm Sunday is first Jesus processing into Jerusalem. And he most likely would have been processing into Jerusalem from the east, down the Mount of Olives. And he is doing so in order to proclaim the reign of God. Now, Borg and Crossan say that the Palm Sunday procession into Jerusalem would have been written in order to serve as a counterpoint to the procession of Pontius Pilate into Jerusalem at the time of Passover from the west. Pontius Pilate didn't spend a whole lot of time in Jerusalem. He preferred to reside in Caesarea on the coast. Who wouldn't? Right? So you have Jesus processing into Jerusalem, proclaiming the reign of God. You have Pilate processing into Jerusalem, proclaiming the reign of the Romans. All right? And so there were troops who would come with Pilate, and their purpose for being there was to keep the peace. The Jews at Passover far outnumbered the Romans in Jerusalem. So, of course, there is a need for crowd control, because rowdies like Jesus and his gang and others could stir people up. Also, it would not have been unusual for Pilate to direct his soldiers to go out and arrest somebody, a troublemaker, in order to keep the peace. Okay? And so it is possible that Pilate had Jesus arrested in order to make an example of him. It's like, we're going to arrest you so that everybody else kind of like understands, don't mess with us. Does that make sense? Okay. So the the Palm Sunday procession also reflects something from the prophet Zechariah, the 9th chapter, 9th verse, who said that a king would enter Jerusalem, quote, humble and riding on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Okay? So, that's Palm Sunday. Then there's Monday, and on Monday there is the dramatic event of the cleansing of the temple. Keep this in mind, that the temple was one of the tools of Roman domination and control over the Jews. Okay? The temple priesthood, the temple authorities were in cahoots with the Romans. and supported what the Romans were doing. And what the Romans were doing was overtaxing the Jews, confiscating their property, and then engaging in commercial farming in Israel in order to increase their trade with other parts of the empire. And the temple priests went along with that program because it helped them, kept them in power. So when Jesus cleanses the temple, all he is doing, or what he is doing actually, is shutting down the normal activities that are going on in the temple. This kind of stuff happened all the time. He is shutting down the normal activities of the temple. It's not like they're doing anything illegal. Okay? So why does he do this? Well, first of all, because Mark has Jesus fulfilling a couple of words of the prophets. First of all, Isaiah chapter 56, verse 7, which refers to the house of prayer. And then Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11, which talks about the den of thieves. Okay? And Mark's point in having Jesus cleanse the temple is that he is saying that God wants justice more than he wants the sacrifices that are offered every day in the temple. I mean, Jesus makes that point in the gospel. What I desire is mercy more than sacrifice, more than your worship. What I want is justice. I want you to treat people with justice. This is what God desires. Okay? And he cleanses the temple because the temple authorities, the temple priesthood, are not doing the work of justice. In fact, they're cooperating in the work of injustice to the Jewish people. Does that make sense? So that's why Jesus cleanses the temple in the Gospel of Mark. Alright? Then there's Tuesday, and I'm not going to get into everything that happens on Tuesday, but Tuesday is a very busy day for Jesus. Tuesday and Holy Week. So much so that in Mark, the amount of coverage, which is almost 3 chapters, is more than the number of verses that Mark devotes to Holy Thursday and Good Friday combined. So Tuesday is a big day. First of all, in chapter 11, verses 20 to 25, you have the story of the tree, the withered tree. And I don't have time to read all of this, but in the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. So, what's that all about? Very simply, the tree represents the corruption that is taking place through the temple priesthood. Jesus' primary enemies were the Romans, but also the Jewish temple priests who cooperated with the Romans. And that's why both the temple priests and the Romans want Jesus done away with. That's really his crime, is undermining the Roman Empire and undermining this good old boy system with the temple priests. Okay? In chapter 11, verses 27 to 33, Jesus' authority is challenged, and Jesus simply pushes back with a question about John the Baptist's authority. Okay? I don't have time to get into all that. You can read that. You know, they question his authority, and he says, I like this response from Jesus. I'll just read a couple verses here. They say to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them? Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it from human origin? And then he says, answer me. You know, it's kind of like one of those, you know, bring it, okay? That's the humanity of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. All right. Third thing, Jesus accuses the temple authorities by telling the parable of the greedy vineyard owners. And this parable is not really about Jesus. The vineyard owner sends his son and they kill the son. That's really not it. It's more about the temple authorities being represented by the people who do harass all these other people, the people who are sent to the vineyard. Okay? And so the temple authorities are harassing Jesus just as those in power back in the day harassed the prophets. We will see that Jesus is kind of the suffering servant of the prophetic movement. Then there is the question of taxes to Caesar, where he says, "Show me the coin," and he says the famous thing, "Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." In other words, pay your taxes and put your money in the Sunday collection. No, that's not what that means, okay? First of all, Jesus kind of exposes those who are calling him out by saying, "Show me the coin of the tribute." And they give him a Roman coin. Now, why are these Jewish guys, why are they carrying Roman coins? It's because they're in cahoots with the Romans. Okay, so already the crowd is like, wait a minute, they're carrying Roman money. Okay, that already exposes their complicity. That's the word. Their complicity with the Romans. Okay, so then he says, "Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." In other words, give the coin back to the Romans. And then he says, "Give to God what belongs to God." And Crossan and Borg, I think, have a marvelous explanation of that little verse. When they say, "Give to God what belongs to God," what Jesus is really saying, according to them, is give God everything and give the Romans nothing. Okay? Very different take on that, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Everything we have, give to God. And give nothing to those who are tyrannical or who seek to oppress. All right? All right. And then Jesus challenges the scribe. I'm not even going to go into that. About the Messiah being the son of David, and he says, no, the Messiah is David's Lord. That's clearly, that's the theology of Mark there. He's saying that the Messiah, Jesus, is superior to David. Not a son of David, but David's Lord. Okay? And then there is the donation of the poor widow who throws the 2 coins in. And when Jesus talks about how she has done the better thing, he is also, by implication, denouncing the Roman system that impoverished that poor widow in the first place. You hear the theme of his being against the Romans and the temple priesthood. Okay, that's a key theme. Okay, and then there is the destruction of the temple and Jesus' return. Here, the temple refers not only to Jewish worship in the temple, but also the temple leadership who are in sympathy with the Romans. That will be destroyed. Okay, not only will the temple be destroyed, but the temple priesthood and its complicity will be destroyed, which it actually was in 70 AD. And then there is what's called the little apocalypse. And remember what an apocalypse is. It's a revelation. It is a vision of the near future. So when we talk about the book of Revelation in May, commercial, when we address the book of Revelation in the next series, we'll see that Revelation is an apocalypse. It is a vision of something that is about to happen. Not that's going to happen 2,000 years later, but that's going to happen in the near future. And Jesus talks about all the things that are coming. A time of suffering, followed by a time of deliverance. Okay? And these verses reflect the Jewish revolt of the years 66 to 70 CE. So Jesus is saying there that it would be good to resist the Romans in that effort, but to do so in a non-violent way. There were groups of Jews called the Zealots who believed in taking up weapons and fighting the Romans on their own terms. And Jesus says, no, that's not the way to do it. And someday when we have a series about the reign of God, we'll explain Jesus' methods of fighting against the Romans, which were healing, sharing meals, wandering or trusting in God, and radical equality. Those are the weapons with which Jesus advocates fighting against the Romans. Okay. All right, so that's Tuesday. Busy day. Wednesday. The chief priests, it says in the beginning of chapter 14, the chief priests and the scribes don't want to arrest Jesus during the festival, during the Passover festival, for fear of a riot. Well, why would they fear a riot? It's because the crowds who they saw on Sunday agree with Jesus, okay? And not with them. Then, after that, we have the woman who anoints Jesus' head. In the Gospel of Luke, she anoints Jesus' feet, right? So, she anoints his head in anticipation of his death and his burial. And Borg and Crossan say that she is actually the first believer. This woman is the first believer and a model believer. And the reason why, and this is a primary theme in Mark's Passion narrative, is because she is willing to publicly stand up for Jesus and participate in his passion and death. And so in a little while later, I will talk about the difference between substitutionary atonement, which for many Christians is the model of Jesus' death and resurrection. That Jesus died took our place and died for our sins, which is not at all what Mark is saying. Mark rather is espousing something called participatory atonement. In other words, what Jesus has done by standing up to tyranny and oppression and suffering the consequences for it in terms of passion and death is what believers should also do. So in other words, it's not that Jesus did for us what we don't have to do, but we should also do what Jesus did. Pretty different, isn't it? Okay. Substitutionary atonement, the theology of substitutionary atonement actually did not come around until the 11th century, 1,000 years after Jesus. And it is the product of a theologian named Anselm of Canterbury. And if you are a follower of Richard Rohr, he makes that point often about this thing about substitutionary atonement is not probably what the gospel writers intended. Be that as it may, okay. So that's what this woman is doing. She is willing, unlike the disciples, to publicly stand up for Jesus. They all run away. She doesn't. Okay. And then there is the Judas's betrayal. And that's in chapter 14, verses 10 to 11. And what we see there is simply the most blatant example of what all the apostles did. They all betrayed him. But Judas betrayed him more than the others. And Mark uses the story of Judas's betrayal. He places it right after the story of the anointing. in order to show us the contrast between someone who is willing to stand up for Jesus and someone who is not. Okay? There's a stark contrast there between the woman who anoints his head and Judas, one of the disciples, who betrays Jesus. All right. So, then there's Thursday. Note that in Mark, the meal that they share is the Passover, which is also the case in Matthew and Luke, but not in John. Okay? So they get to the meal. Jesus predicts Judas's betrayal, and he sees this as a betrayal of friendship. When he says, it's the one who is eating with me. So to eat with someone is to share. That's an act of friendship. So Judas is betraying that friendship. Also here, Mark has Jesus' words reflect Psalm 41, verse 9. Even my bosom friend in whom I trust, who ate of my bread, has lifted his heel against me. And I'm not going to go deeply into this thing about were these prophetic predictions that were fulfilled, or was it Mark looking back and saying, oh, this happened, and so there's a verse in Scripture that prefigures it. Okay? We already had that discussion. In Mark, there is the quote, consecration, if you will, where Jesus shares his body and blood with the apostles. You know, if you look closely at the Gospel of John, he never does that. He never says, this is my body, this is my blood. There is no blessing of the bread or blessing of the cup. Okay? In the Gospel of John, it is the washing of the disciples' feet that is the central act there. Okay? So Mark uses the Last Supper not so much as a prefiguring of the Eucharistic liturgy, rather as an interpretation of the entire ministry of Jesus. So, the bread, for example, reflects the other feeding stories. In Mark, Jesus feeds the 5,000, and Jesus feeds the 4,000. And so, the Last Supper for Mark is the third miracle of the loaves. Okay? It's not the institution of the Eucharist, it is the third miracle of the loaves. The cup is a symbol of Jesus' suffering and death. Jesus, in Mark, Jesus will refer to the cup that he must drink of. Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. That is the cup of his suffering and death. Okay? And then there is his mention of the blood of the covenant. And the blood of the covenant is not the Eucharistic blood, although it has come to mean that. It is rather the blood of the ratification of the covenant, just as blood was sprinkled in order to ratify the covenant of Moses. Okay? Does that make sense? So, Borg and Crossan say that there are 4 layers of meaning to the Last Supper in Mark. First, it is a continuation of Jesus' practice of shared meals. I've mentioned shared meals as one of the signs, Jesus' signs of resistance against the Romans. The sharing of meals with anyone and everyone. Okay? And the sharing of meals in Mark is part of the proclamation of the reign of God for Jesus. Second layer. Mark uses the words, the same 4 verbs in the other miracles of the loaves that he uses in the Last Supper. Jesus took bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it. Okay? So when those 4 verbs are put together, they're used in the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, in the feeding of the 4,000, and they're used here once again in the Last Supper. Okay? Third, The Last Supper is a reenactment of the Passover meal. That's a Jewish celebration, right? For Mark, it is not the first Mass. It is the the celebration of the Passover. And finally, it is Jesus. Mark depicts it as Jesus' invitation to his followers to participate in his upcoming suffering and death. Okay? To do as he is about to do. Now that it's only 5 minutes after 11, let's talk about the Passion narrative in Mark. What do you say? Well, I spent that time because I think it's important to frame the Passion narrative in the context of what led up to it. All right. So, first, some words of introduction. First word of introduction. In Mark's Gospel, the cross is not at all a surprise. It's not like, holy cow, why'd they do that? Well, as you read the entire Gospel of Mark, you see that it's inevitable. That what Jesus was doing would, of course, lead to his crucifixion. Okay? Jesus' actions actually provoked his enemies. And he kind of brought it on. I mean, I would not say that Jesus predicted his passion and death so much as he just knew that this was where it was going. I use as an analogy Martin Luther King's sermon the night before he died. I have been to the mountaintop. I may not get there with you. And then the next day he was killed. Okay, so it's not, I think people like that. They know that what they're doing is inciting people to anger. And Jesus, I think, knew that as well. So, not a big surprise. Okay, second, Jesus is not a passive victim of his death. He chose to go there because of the way that he lived. Okay? His actions, I'm pretty much making the same point. He knew that what he was doing would lead to what happened. Okay. And Mark prepares us for the Passion all throughout the Gospel. First of all, there is the, quote, Passion of John the Baptist, okay, which mirrors the Passion and death of Jesus. If you read chapter 6, verses 17 to 29, first of all, John is arrested, he's betrayed, he's executed. Herod, if you notice, is reluctant to have John killed. He kind of was intrigued by him. Just as Pilate would be reluctant to have Jesus killed. Herod believes that John has risen from the dead, okay, and has reappeared in the person of Jesus. John's body is laid in a tomb, a very unlikely action. And finally, Mark depicts both John and Jesus as rejected prophets, just like the prophets of the Old Testament. Okay, so if you read chapter 6, verses 17 to 29 very carefully, you'll see that there's a parallel between the passion and death of John and the passion and death of Jesus. Okay. Then, in chapter 3, verse 6, and chapter 11, verse 18, there are actually, Mark tells us that certain people plotted to do in Jesus. First by the Herodians and the Pharisees in chapter 3, and then by the chief priests and the scribes in chapter 11. So, Mark is laying the groundwork for what is going to come in the Passion. And then Jesus himself predicts his own passion 3 times in chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10. Okay? All right. Now, the Passion narrative. So it begins with the walk to the Mount of Olives. When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters." Wow. For it is written, "I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." Okay. That sentence, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered, comes from the prophet Zechariah. Chapter 13, verse 7. Okay? So, Jesus right off the bat predicts what the disciples will do. And, wow, these are his closest friends. And as we know from our other things that we've talked about in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples never really get it, right? The disciples, even though they're so close to him, never really understand what Jesus is about. Even after the resurrection, they still kind of say, oh, well, which one's going to be the greatest? And Jesus like, really? Still, you don't get it. Okay, so, but this message about you will desert me is also a question directed to Mark's community around the year 70 or the early 70s. And I'm not going to walk over there because there's a camera and it would mess up the whole, and this is my good side, so I don't want to, if I had a good side. So this question is directed to the followers in the year 70. Will you desert me? Or will you stay with me? Now that the temple is destroyed. Okay? Are you going to still be my follower? Or are you not going to be my follower? Jesus then predicts his resurrection. He says, but after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. So, just as Galilee was his base of operations during his ministry, so Galilee will be the beginning, or will be the base of operations for the disciples after the resurrection. It's interesting that it's Galilee in Mark, but in Luke, it's Jerusalem. I point out some of these discrepancies because, and I've said this 100 times, for the life of me, I cannot see how someone would say every word of this is literally true, because either their base of operations was Galilee, or Jerusalem, or somewhere else. But it can't be all of them, right? So the simple answer is there are different gospel writers at different times, for different reasons, for different communities. And that clears up a lot of that, well, they just kind of forgot the details and okay. All right. Then Peter, supposedly the best, he says, even if all lose faith, I will not. And Jesus says, I don't think so. Okay? All right, and then there is the scene in Gethsemane. First, we are told that Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him. And I've mentioned this before, that when these names are mentioned, these are attempts by the gospel writer to legitimize these people as authorities in the church. So Peter is legitimized, and James and John are given legitimacy as authorities in the early church by saying that Jesus takes them and not the others with him. Okay? These three were also with Jesus. They're mentioned by name in the raising of the daughter of Jairus, and that was in chapter 5, and also in the Transfiguration. So, the fact that I say, hey, you three go with, that I am somehow citing their greater closeness than the others. Okay? All right, so then Jesus utters his prayer of lament. And listen to the very human language in here. He took with him Peter, James, and John, began to be distressed and agitated. We don't normally think of Jesus as distressed or agitated. And he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. And he threw himself on the ground and he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, For you all things are possible. Remove this cup, there's the cup, from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. You will notice if you read, by the time we get to the Gospel of John, Jesus never prays when they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. They go to the garden and he's simply arrested. There's none of this. It's like Jesus is completely in charge of his own passion and death in John. Not so here. Here, Jesus is deeply agitated and distressed and grieved, even to death. Okay? Mark here depicts Jesus as the quote, the just one of the Old Testament. One who only has God to rely on. And if you look at Psalm 30, Psalm 42, Psalm 61, Psalm 116, you will see that. Where the psalmist says, Lord, everyone else has deserted me. I have only you to trust. Then he says, remove this cup from me. But of course, then he says, yet not what I will, but what you will. And this is really the heart of Mark's theology in the gospel. Follow the will of God, whether it's convenient or not. Do the will of God. And even Jesus has to struggle with doing the will of God. Gives us all a little bit of hope, doesn't it? Because we all sometimes have to face those moments when we have to do the will of God, even when it's not fun, even when it's not pleasant, even when it's when it's difficult. Okay, so the disciples, ever on the ready, fall asleep. And so they don't get what's going on. Jesus warns them to stay awake. He has already warned them back in chapter 13 to stay awake. And this staying awake is also an admonition to the Mark community over there in 70 CE, that they should stay awake. Okay? I didn't mention in the little apocalypse that Jesus, warns the followers. There will be others who step forward and say, I am he, and follow me. And he warns them there, stay awake. So that warning is given not so much to the disciples in the year 30 as it is to the disciples in the year 70, the followers of Jesus later on. Okay? Stay awake. Don't stray. Don't go down the wrong path. Okay? Then finally at the end of this, Jesus says, enough. Enough. His hour has come. It's time for him to drink of the cup of the passion. Okay. Then there is the arrest. And Mark frames the arrest of Jesus as more than just a simple arrest scene. He frames it in more cosmic terms as a moment of encounter between good and evil. Okay? Judas is immediately identified as one of the 12. Mark identifies him as one of the 12, which only makes his betrayal worse, right? He's one of the closest ones to him. And then he has Judas give Jesus the kiss of greeting, which is another betrayal. Okay, makes it even worse. And here, you can reflect back to the book of Proverbs, chapter 27, verse 6. Well-meant are the wounds a friend inflicts, but profuse are the kisses of an enemy. Okay, so perhaps the hearers of this gospel would have thought about Proverbs, maybe. So there's not much to the arrest. It happens very quickly. There's very little detail, except that we are told that one of those who was standing around, we're not told exactly who it is, but just, in other words, this looks like just kind of a mob scene where stuff is just happening. Things are just happening quickly. And it says, somebody draws his sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest's slave. And so neither the attacker nor the victim is clearly identified. The attacker and the victim will become more clearly identified in the other Gospels. Okay? One side note, in the other Gospels, Jesus uses this moment as an opportunity to preach about nonviolence. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword, and put the sword back into its... Back when I was a boy, it used to be put the sword back into its scabbard, right? Rather than its sheath. Whatever happened to scabbard? What a great word that is. Okay? But in this particular case, the cutting off of the ear of the servant might have been just something that happened in the confusion and the chaos of the moment. Okay? So there's no speech here by Jesus. Okay. And rather, Jesus kind of calls out the fact that they choose to arrest him at night. And darkness, of course, is a symbol of the forces of evil. They arrest him at night rather than during the day when he's out there speaking to everybody. Okay? Well, that's, in other words, you guys are kind of cowardly. You could have arrested me in front of everybody, but you didn't. And then, of course, the disciples flee. They fulfill Jesus' prediction. And then there is this thing, and this is unique to Mark, about the guy who's wearing only a linen cloth. Was he at a toga party or what? What exactly is this guy doing here? And he starts to run away, and they pull the sheet, and he runs away naked. I mean, the commentators that I have read about this really don't know what the heck Mark is talking about here. The best that I was able to come up with is that it's kind of a symbolic reinforcement of the abandonment by the disciples. So they abandon their loyalty to Jesus, they abandon their promises, they even abandon their clothes. But that's lame. I think some commentators say that the naked guy might be Mark himself, but anyway, and that's only in the Gospel of Mark. It's a curious little detail. All right. So then there is the trial before the Sanhedrin and Peter's denials. So this scene takes place in the court of the high priest. Peter follows Jesus into the courtyard. So far, he is being the tough guy, and he's continuing to follow Jesus. Okay, he's not abandoning him. So Jesus in chapter 14, verses 55 to 65 is brought before the full council, the full Sanhedrin. And Mark writes about it as though it were a trial. However, a number of things that happen in this scene were expressly forbidden by Jewish law. All right? First of all, the trial is held on Passover. Can't do that. Second, the trial is held at night, and it's held at the house of the high priest. Both of these things were forbidden by Jewish law. So what's going on here? The death sentence, third, the death sentence comes immediately after the testimony. That should not have happened. There should have been a lapse of time. Should not have rendered their verdict on the spot like that. Finally, the testimony of the witnesses does not agree. And even then and there, you had to have at least two witnesses agree, on the charge, provide evidence that agrees, right? Doesn't happen. So this is very fishy. So the conclusion that is drawn is that this is not really a trial. That this is simply an interrogation. Okay? This is testimony. So what is the testimony against Jesus? It is, we have heard him say, I will destroy this temple made by human hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made by human hands. Jesus does not answer this charge. And this particular charge is ironic because it actually is true. I mean, theologically, it is true. The temple was destroyed the one made by human hands. And in 3 days, another one was built up. So the new temple for those Christians in 70, the new temple is Jesus. And this, after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, became one of the points of divergence between the Jews, the other Jews, and those Christians who still identified as Jews. So the question became, after the destruction of the temple, now what? Now where do we offer sacrifice? And now, what do we do? We don't have our primary focus of worship. And at least Mark's community is saying, yes, we do have a temple. And that temple is the person of Jesus. Does that make sense? Okay, so what about this thing not made by human hands? That particular phrase, made by human hands, not made by human hands, is unique to Mark. And it reflects a distinction that was drawn in the Old Testament. If you look at Psalm 115, verse 4, or the book of Wisdom, chapter 13, verse 10, in those verses, pagan gods are referred to as made by hands. So in other words, what Mark is having Jesus say here is that a temple of human origin will be replaced by a true temple of divine origin. And that true temple is Jesus. And as I've said before, what about the sacrifices that took place in the temple? The animal sacrifices that took place every day. They will be replaced by the unbloody sacrifice of the Eucharist. Does that make sense? So Jesus is the temple, and the Eucharist is the replacement sacrifice. Then they say, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Which, of course, is a question that would not have been asked. Are you the Christ in the year 30? Okay. This time Jesus gives a very emphatic answer. He says, "I am." That ring a bell? I am. Okay. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power. The right hand of the power is the right hand of God, and coming with the clouds of heaven. Okay? So these different titles, Son of Man, all this kind of thing, sitting at the right hand, have been used throughout Mark's Gospel. Chapter 1, chapter 8, chapter 15, chapter 9. So, again, for Mark, this scene is ironic. It is an ironic declaration of Jesus' identity by his accusers. And the fact that Jesus says, "Yep, it's me," is Mark's sign that Jesus is no longer trying to keep the Messianic secret. Remember early in the Gospel, when Jesus performs, miracles and signs and heals and whatever, what's he always tell the people that he healed? Shh, don't tell anybody, right? Don't tell them. Go to the priest, but don't tell anybody what has happened. Now, he's out in the open, okay? The time of the Messianic secret is over, and Jesus proclaims his own Messiahship. So then they render their verdict, and the verdict is blasphemy, which Jesus has not declared that he is God in this. Son of Man is a reference to the book of Daniel, chapter 7. It's not a reference to divinity. These things later came to be identified as parts or titles of Jesus' divinity, but they are not in the context of the gospel. Does that make sense? So, Christ, Son of God, Son of Man, are not titles in this context that refer to a divine being. We look at them now and we say, well, sure, those are references that Jesus is God. That conclusion wasn't drawn until 300 years later at the Council of Nicaea. Okay. But anyway, the verdict comes down, and the verdict is blasphemy. They want to accuse Jesus of the very worst thing that they can accuse him of claiming to be of divine origin. Okay? Because for the Jews, there is only one God, Yahweh, and that's it. So to claim to be of divine origin is blasphemy. All right. So then Jesus is mocked, and the mocking of Jesus is simply a reflection for Mark of the plight of the suffering servant of Isaiah chapter 50, where it says, this is Isaiah chapter 50, I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting. Okay? Jesus is the fulfillment of the suffering servant, which is prefigured in Isaiah. Now we have Peter's denials. And again, as we saw with the anointing of the woman and then the betrayal by Judas, here we have Jesus coming out very strongly and saying things, about himself. And then immediately after that, we have the denials, the betrayal by Peter. Mark does that juxtaposition on purpose. And the accusations made to Peter focus on his personal relationship with Jesus. You are one of them. You are a Galilean. And Peter's denials are a reflection of Mark's idea of discipleship. What does Peter say? I do not know him. For Mark, to be a disciple of Jesus means literally to know him. Okay? And again, this admonition is directed to the people of the Mark community in the year 70. Do you know who Jesus is? Or would you say at the moment of crisis, I do not know him? Okay? As always, the scriptural reading scriptural reading is addressed to a community after the fact, and sometimes well after the fact. So it has to be read in that context. Okay? It can't be read strictly in the context of the time in which it is depicted. Okay? All right. Please feel free to... This is your chance to be on camera. This is your moment. so then there is the trial before Pilate. Pilate immediately asks him, are you the king of the Jews? Now notice that the accusation made by the Sanhedrin was a religious accusation. Pilate's accusation is a political accusation. Okay? Are you the king? Jesus' answer is somewhat ambiguous. Well, you say so. Kind of passive-aggressive, isn't it? So he doesn't really deny it, but his answer is not nearly as strong as his answer to the Sanhedrin. Once again, here Mark depicts Jesus as the suffering servant, and here the reference is to the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Okay, he is acting as the suffering servant. So then there is a question of Jesus or Barabbas. First thing to note is that outside of the Gospels, there is no historical record of a prisoner being released during Passover. So apparently the Gospel writers made that up. All right? There's nothing that says that was a custom during Passover, for Pilate or for the procurator or the governor to release somebody. Okay? And it's interesting because Barabbas is portrayed as an insurrectionist and a revolutionary, but Mark has also depicted Jesus throughout the gospel as an insurrectionist and a revolutionary, but just a different kind. So think ahead to 70 CE, right? Who do you want to follow? Do you want to follow the Barabbas model of violent insurrection or the Jesus model of non-violent revolution and non-violent insurrection? Does that make sense? Okay. Another point of interest when we look at this is, why would the crowd that had hailed Jesus on Sunday, waved branches of palm and said Hosanna, now why would they shout, crucify him? What happened? Well, the best explanation, and I agree with Borg and Crossan on this, is that the crowd that is here in this scene is a different crowd. This is a crowd that would have been gathered by the temple authorities who wanted Jesus done away with. Okay? Does that make sense? This is, otherwise it doesn't make any sense for the people who were praising him as their king on Sunday to suddenly want him dead 5 days later. That doesn't make any sense at all. Okay? All right. Another point. Pilate, not nearly as strongly as he does in some of the other Gospels, he kind of defends Jesus' innocence. Now that clearly is not historically accurate. I've talked about Pilate before. Pilate, a couple points about Jesus and Pilate. First of all, in all likelihood, there would not have been this big public, display and all that. What normally happened in crucifixion was, okay, so you at this table, you guys are all, it's your turn for crucifixion, okay? So you would show up and, somebody would be sitting there. Maybe Pilate, probably not. He had other things to do, like eat lunch. So people would all line up and they would simply identify themselves. Are you so-and-so? Are you so-and-so? Are you so-and-so? Okay, off to the cross. And so, Jesus' trial, if you will, would very likely have been nothing more than that. Just showing his driver's license or his ID. And is that who you are? Get out of here. Okay? The second thing is, Pilate would never have tried to declare someone's innocence. Pilate was very fond of crucifying people. He was to the point where, and I have read this, that the Roman Senate actually had to pass a resolution telling Pilate to calm down a little bit and not crucify so many people. Okay? Pilate loved to crucify people. He would sometimes crucify hundreds of people at one time. Okay? Yeah, so for Pilate to suddenly say, I don't know, it just doesn't make any sense in terms of history at all. Okay? But finally, Pilate reluctantly gives in. Okay? There is, what Mark here again is doing is using a little bit of irony, because, think about it, Pilate, who should not have recognized Jesus' innocence, amazingly somehow does. But the Jews who are out there shouting for his crucifixion, they don't get it. Quite ironic, isn't it? The ones who should have understood don't. And the one who certainly would never have understood kind of does. All right. So then there is the mocking of Jesus in chapter 15, verses 16 to 20. And here, Jesus is dressed as a king in a purple robe and a crown. Okay? Which, again, shows Markan irony, because they are actually hailing the one who is their king. Okay? Even though they don't recognize it, but that's what they're actually doing. Interestingly, in some of the other Gospels, Jesus is not dressed in purple, he's dressed in red, the robe of a soldier rather than the robe of a king. Okay. Now the crucifixion. And so, Jesus carries his cross, which would probably have been the cross piece, because the upright pieces would have been, they were in the ground permanently.